let me start with a slight dose of suspicion about the term post-truth era. I believe that such choice of words wrongly suggests that in the era preceding Trump's election and Brexit, political deliberation and achievement of consensus were based on observation of truth. Second, such truth is understood mostly as correspondence with facts, and this correspondence supposedly ascertained by expert knowledge and widely spread by traditional, supposedly honest mass media in order to provide citizens with vital information, thus enabling them to meaningfully participate in public debate and act like responsible citizens. Now, such a truth era probably never existed. Not only because fake news has always been part of political landscape, even in the liberal democracies, but mostly because, first reason, people always filtered information according to their preconceptions and values and made choices at least as much guided by their emotions and adherence to some practical principles as they might have been guided by their knowledge about states of affairs. The second reason, when it comes to the most common political matters of concern, such as justice, equality, inclusion, work conditions, health policy, social issues, the truth cannot be simply considered as correspondence to reality. A pragmatist move from correspondence theory of truth to a kind of consensus theory of truth seems necessary in this context. The norms of correctness here are not scientific criteria for validity, observation, hypothesis, experimentation, and mostly testability according to Popper. They are rather socially accepted norms guiding our actions. It is thus worthy to acknowledge that each modern society develops its own institutional truth-producing infrastructure, including schools, legal system, demography, sociology, economics, and the media, where truth is not so much discovered, but rather achieved and reproduced in a form of consensus, gathering the whole community around some basic principles. However, this truth-producing infrastructure is far from being perfect. It can establish as truth things for which there is little or no evidence, chemical weapons in Iraq already before, and it is constantly prey to abuse by those to whom it grants privileges. And crucially, it is slow to build, but may be very quick to be shattered, as it might be happening right now with generalized distrust towards expert knowledge. To my eyes, then, what we are witnessing lately is not so much that people don't care anymore about facts and are guided more by emotions than before, but we rather witness the lack of confidence in this whole truth-producing infrastructure that is revealed as pragmatically weak or unable to produce a consensus about what is right and what is wrong. For me, then, if the post-truth era has any meaning at all, it is precisely that we are living in times where the very credibility of knowledge-producing institutions is losing against its competitors. And among those, social medias are of course, the biggest challengers. So, if that's the situation, how did we arrive here? This will be my first question. How should we explain that institutions such as traditional media and the community of experts and intellectuals are drained of their credibility? Unfortunately, the most common answer is to search for the enemy, instead of asking what we have got wrong ourselves. Instead of asking about structural reasons and our own contribution to them, we simplify the task by asking who is to blame. Mostly in the Czech Republic, the first and most usual answer to this question is not even social media and the social bubbles that they create, but rather Russian propaganda or information war in which we are on the side of truth and the Russians and those who believe them on the side of wrong. The Czech think tank, European Values, is the main fighter against the Russian influence in Czech media space. But this institute has also its own political agenda, defending rather neoconservative values and producing truth about our necessity to develop transatlantic operations. Well, it is certainly possible to fight ideology with ideology. But firstly, European Values, this think tank, would never present themselves as defenders of ideology, only the others are. Second, to construe such a fight in terms of struggle between truth and fake, or between good and evil is at least an oversimplification, at the worst, a conspiracy theory. By the way, their program, aiming to expose instrument of Russian influence and disinformation operation, is called Kremlin Watch. What should alert us is already the name, not only reminiscent of McCarthyism, but also strangely resembling the xenophobic website in Czech Republic, which is called Anti-Multiculti Watch. And it's featured by the radical supremacist group called White Media. And maybe some of you are proud to be on their list of enemies. Accusing the supporters of, for example, President Zeman, of being ideologically biased or being paid by Moscow, as it happened in the discussion about fake news by people from European Values last Tuesday, might not be the best strategy. If they are calling supporters of Zeman to be victims of propaganda, it might easily be turned back not only against them, but also against all conventional news critical of Zeman. As a result, his supporters will treat all such criticism as propaganda and hence ignore it. So it is not working from the pragmatical point of view. But the problem is deeper than my eventual antipathies towards this neoconservative think tank, Evropské hodnoty, and my doubts about their methodology and strategies. The problem is also on our side. It might be easier for many of us who claim to be liberals or even liberal left to blame Russian propaganda for the large support of Zeman, as it was before the case in Trump's election, for the spread of anti-European feelings and distrust towards mainstream media, then to accept that many voters have a very different understanding of our country than we do, of its post-89 transformation and its foreign policy orientation. I propose to read the current emphasis on fake news as symptomatic of a certain dismay, désarroi, of liberal elites or established parties, unable to acknowledge the failures of their past economical choices and delusions of their policies, hitting harder the lower income classes or otherwise, even symbolically, unprivileged parts of population, which see themselves as abandoned to the requirements of anonymous workings of the world financial system, and abandoned also by liberal elites. So, instead of searching for enemies, we should further inquire into hidden reasons for the generalized lack of trust in mainstream journalism. In Czech Republic, from 2007 until at least 2010, almost all the mainstream media were reporting the expert knowledge about the necessity to adopt the politics of austerity as the only rational response to the financial crisis. At these times, Czech people largely believe these experts, mostly, but not only economists. And they demonstrated this trust by voting a government based on its promises of austerity measures. Even after the fall of that right-wing government, it was Topolánek, people were rather satisfied with the technocratic caretaker government of Jan Fischer, in Czech it's úřednická vláda, that followed, and that was composed, again, mostly by experts. And these measures didn't hit those who defended them, economy experts, journalists, or people introducing these policies, but they rather rendered the life of the unprivileged even more precarious. So it might be, and it's really only a hypothesis, that the imposed media consensus, at least in Czech Republic, and delusions from its aftermath are at least partly responsible for the loss of credibility that people have in conventional media and expert knowledge. Kuhnian, from Thomas Kuhn, Kuhnian analogy might help to explain what I have in mind. If a paradigm shift is to be successfully achieved, two conditions at least must be met. Firstly, there must be a crisis of normal science, anomalies, unsuccessfully explained phenomena. And second, there must be an alternative paradigm whose promise is to explain all the phenomena of the ancient model and to give an account of those unexplained. In our context, we have then to take into account, on one hand, the crisis produced by some of the unsuccessful liberal policies and their defense in conventional media, and on the other hand, the birth and the widespread of alternative sources of explanation. Now, this analogy also allows us to explain why alternative sources sources, those who are full of disinformation, are not a successful new paradigm, and why the shift to post-truth is not wholly accomplished. Their effective explanatory power is rather weak, it is full of conspiracy, it is not even consistent, and it still doesn't gather a majority of the interested actors. So we are not in a new era, but rather somewhere in between. The lesson from this is that we cannot simply turn back, we have to find new ways of dealing with disinformation and new ways of popularizing to render accessible what we consider to be not only true, but also to be right in the practical sense. So now the second part, a shorter one, what we have to do? What can researchers in humanities and social sciences do about this whole situation? Perfect. First, they can provide analysis, sociological analysis. First, we need a better understanding why so many people are inclined to trust dubious sources. One hypothesis might be that one of the factors is also the feeling of being marginalized, abandoned by the elites. The question to be tested could be formulated in the following manner. Are the precarious socioeconomic conditions among crucial factors of making people so sensitive to fake news? A further hint in this direction of research, believing false claims and spreading them might also be read as declaration of sympathy to those marginalized groups that see themselves as abandoned by the processes of globalization. Second, journalism studies or media studies generally, in which we should further ask, why such growing distrust in mainstream media? And for the lack of time, I would simply remind you of my above-mentioned example about austerity measures. Third, what we can do is discursive analysis. Anna Durnova is going in the direction. We can inquire how established parties, even on the left, have incorporated certain elements of fear and distrust about everything alien, European Union, immigrants, in the contemporary context, here in Czech Republic, of identity panic. We don't know what we are. Officials of Czech social democracy presented more than often both the immigration and the European Union as threats to our country and to our values. In this way, they only contributed to legitimize the worst xenophobic parties, such as Okamura SPD, whose success is fueled, without any doubt, by spreading of fake news about Islam and European Union. Also, many commentators in mainstream media are outlining the danger of the fundamentally alien culture of Islam that posed to the rest of us, reinforcing such a dichotomy. On the right side of the Czech political spectrum, this think tank European Values is also serving the idea that the West and Russia are locked in a clash of civilization. And even though they claim to defend values of liberal democracy, they have been proven to overestimate also the Islamistic threat in the context of Czech Republic. So, second, we should also provide a better explanation why fact-checking sites are pragmatically ineffective to change people's wrong beliefs. First, there is a rather simple finding that most of the fact-checking sites are low profile and little read. But it's becoming about to change in this presidential election. Most journalists are asking demagogue CZ about what's wrong and what's right on both sides. Second, the time too is at our disadvantage, since it takes mere seconds to think up a very specific and completely bullshit claim. But it might take days or even weeks to conclusively prove it false. So the fake news has already made the tour of the planet, while fact-checkers are still trying to Google out the most reliable sources, or even worse, visit the archives. Third, all this should be done with the notion that simply checking the claims is insufficient in itself, without a proper contextualizing that might be provided also by academy. One thing that we can surely do as academics is to be at disposal of journalists trying to check their facts with us and put them in broader context of understanding. It rarely happens to philosophers, but it does happen more often to researchers in political science, historians, or even literary theorists, specialists, as it was the case of the distorted claim of President Zeman about the pre-war journalist Ferdinand Peroutka, used as example of intellectual seduced by Hitler. And it was really wrong. So Fourth, there is the issue of the simplicity of the lie and the complexity of the truth. Complexity is rejected as the last resort of experts to bamboozle everyone else. So the challenge is here to express our findings in an accessible and public-friendly manner without falling into oversimplification. Another thing that can be provided by social and humanities, even psychological studies might help here when we ask, why are the fact-checking tools and measures often unable to repair the damage already done by spreading rumors, gossip, and misinformation? In some cases, confronting people with correcting facts even strengthen their beliefs, a phenomenon called the backfire effect. The backfire effect occurs when, in the face of contradictory evidence, established opinions do not change but actually increase, get stronger. I will skip. And finally, educational responses to the fake news issue. We should plead for more classes about digital literacy and critical thinking in secondary education. As being an educator myself and sometimes doing lectures in high school, I believe that schools can do a better job in preparing youth for democracy in the age of social media. Teachers can prepare new generations to recognize and treat with suspicion sources that are deliberately one-sided. In short, we have to develop reflexes to prevent people from sharing dubious content without thinking twice, let alone checking to determine if it's true. In the same time, we should be aware that we are not teaching the truth, but rather attitudes. And most of all, we are trying to instill some fundamental values about justice, equal rights, respect to the alterity, and why not also solidarity. In thinking about justice, the aim is not to produce a timeless theory to be true about justice, but to spell out ideas, values, and modes of conduct that we believe to be good for a pluricultural liberal democracy. And what we believe to be good is revisable in the light of changes in society and also by critiques provided by groups who are challenging our stances and convictions. Finally, I would plead for a rhetorical shift both in our educational approach and in our accountability towards civic society, to present the results of our pursuit of truth as members of the academy with less arrogance, acknowledging that some of our claims are hypotheses and possible objections exist. Concretely, in the case of philosophers, when we are asked by the so-called man on the street, what is philosophy good for? And we answer with Nietzsche's quote, it serves to fight stupidity, we should always add mostly the unseen stupidity of ourselves and the prejudices coming from our own field of study. In that way, an acknowledgement of our own past hybris might surely help. Thank you.
Maybe instead of proper introduction, I will try to explain the title of my talk. The phrase in Geschwindigkeit praktizierend comes from a complaint of the city of Bern against French diplomats who deceitfully distributed misleading information at great speed. The complaint was issued in 1507. At that time, the originally Latin term practica, meaning legal or medical practices, procedures, became an extremely negative term, almost a vulgar term, applied to a fake news and post-truth behavior. Let me quote a brief summary which could cure us and from a too simplified view or opinion that post-truth era comes after a truly truth era, something similar Ondřej talked about. A pamphlet, this is what you have on the board, a pamphlet printed in 1513 in Strasbourg described pratique as the Italian, principally Venetian, and French art of deception. As with corruption and sodomy, these were considered to have come from the south, where, quote from the document, such things are practiced every day of the year, gepraktiziert für Jahr und Tag. These evil and foreign acts of deception supposedly meant that no one could no longer distinguish between true and false. Printed propaganda pamphlets about the election of Charles V in 1519 warned readers that the French want to influence the election throughout their vast practices. Geschwinden Praktiken. My examples are coming from German archives, that's why the French are so omnipresent in that. Reformers such as Luther and Melanchthon warned of the Praktiken of the Catholics, whose intentionally misleading messages one should never trust. So therefore, throughout the following presentation, I will keep in mind that we are not dealing with an utterly new aspect of our social and political life. However, at the same time, I will try to make clear where I see the specifics and specific problems of the post-truth era and fake news era. Now, here we go. Now, you all know that in 2016, Oxford Dictionaries labeled post-truth as the word of the year. According to the definition, it relates or denotes circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotions and personal belief. What is interesting for me is that the post-truth era witnesses how truth and integrity slowly but surely disappears from the set of traditional political values. As I have shown in the introduction, the post-truth or fake news is not a new phenomenon. Rather, it is its omnipresence and relevance which is specific for our society. A further distinction must be made. The concept of post-truth, as far as I know, differs from what Harry Frankfurt famously called and elaborated as bullshit. It was one of the terms used by Ondřej as well, because post-truth or post-fact intentionally tries to substitute or obscure truth or facts, and perhaps even more importantly, it's deliberately interested in the change in its receiver. Frankfurt characterized bullshit as a special sort of utterance which doesn't care about the truthful distinction, basically doesn't care about it. Bullshit is merely uttered, emitted in order to allow the speaker to get through the conversation, namely to bullshit around. The difference between liar and the bullshitter is that liar intentionally deceives us about a certain state of affairs. He or she wants to lead us away from the truth. Bullshitter deceives about something else. This bullshitter deceives the audience about his or her relation to the truth. The fact about himself that the bullshitter hides is that the truth values of his statements are of no central interest to him. Post-truth or fake news, on the other hand, have a clear intention to conceal truth and leads its receiver, its audience, away from it. Another important point, as far as I can see, in the post-truth is that it describes an environment within which quantity, numbers, do matter in a certain respect more, and quality has no value and no force. If the only measure for media is the number of viewers or number of issues sold, then naturally no one cares about anything else. If, in populistic form of democracy, the only thing which matters is the number of votes, then populism and fake news flourish, since they get the votes. 3. And we've been asked to somehow connect it with the academia and expertise. Yet, unfortunately, I have to start with acknowledging that the same effect can be observed within academia, which actually might be prima facie characterized in the opposition to the post-truth world, but only seemingly. If the only measure is the number, quantity of outcomes, as current administration usually calls our books and articles, then such things and features as predatory journals and vanity press flourish, since it does not matter what is published, where it is published, but merely that it is published and that there is a lot of it. This crucially undermines the traditional role of expertise from basically inside the very sort of expertise which should be the academia. The mistrust in expertise is yet another aspect of the post-truth era. If all opinions are equal, namely the quality does not matter, and the expert is no different to any layman, one thing is basically the lack of knowledge among population concerning politics, history, or science. Well, basically this is an old problem and again nothing new. However, as far as I can see, the bigger problem is that ignorance is nowadays seen as a new virtue. To reject the advice of experts is to assert autonomy, a way for people to demonstrate their independence from nefarious elites and insulate their increasingly fragile egos from ever being wrong. You don't want to follow the elites. This is something wrong, basically. This is what you don't want to do. You want to be authentic and autonomous in your decision, and therefore you can't be ever wrong. That's basically how it works. So it's not only ignorance that is the problem. It is ignorance being promoted among the values of contemporary society under the heading of autonomy or authenticity. In this respect, it's interesting to dwell a bit more on the phrase fragile egos used a while ago. One of the main sources for the fragility of the egos can be seen in a contemporary way of living online. Facebook and other social media take into extreme the idea by Jean-Jacques Rousseau that it is the side of the other that is the source of modernity, all problems. Our integrity is shattered when we act not only according to our own judgment, but when we try to incorporate the fact that we are being seen by others, evaluated, checked, compared, liked, or hated, basically the activities which are now most common activity on social media. That brings me to my third set of thoughts which I would like to share with you today. Well, as already mentioned by Ondřej, quite dismissed on one hand, but I want to dwell on it a bit. It is well-established fact, which I'm using a very English term, that internet and social media play a decisive role in the process of diminishing the role of experts and expertise. They create opinion bubbles, which, against all their expectation, generally lower the argumentative, critical, and cognitive skills of their users. Moreover, the prime goal of nearly all social media platforms and their owners is profit. Their users are both their customers as well as products. Yet again, what matters in the end is quantity, not the quality. It's actually interesting to know that one of the first investors into Mark Zuckerberg's platform, namely into the Facebook, was a Silicon Valley billionaire, Peter Thiel, a former major in philosophy at Stanford. I have no idea how a philosophy major becomes a millionaire, but that's a different question. However, he did that. The reason behind his investment, the reason behind his investments lie deep in his philosophy studies. Facebook, according to him, is a perfect tool for a natural mimetic desire, which was so emphasized by René Girard. The mimetic desire can be basically described as accepting the object of desire from someone who desired it first. A further result is that we desire and love those who are desired and loved by others. The mimetic desire is not only the main force behind all human development, according to Girard. Well, this can be nicely illustrated on education, for example, but it entails a negative aspect which is fueled by envy and which leads to rivalry and possibly violent conflict as well. And Facebook is right now the great platform which allows the mimetic desire to manifest itself with immense intensity. It is important to basically notice that social media have no financial interest in telling the truth. The social media, such as Facebook, are basically highly precise and personified advertising companies selling their users' data to the third parties. It's rather the other way around. If truth would be financially interesting, then it would be on the Facebook, not that what's on the Facebook is the truth. 5 minutes. Which brings me to the last point, where I will have to skip a bit. Yet, however, there is one aspect of democratic society which I believe is strongly undermined in the post-truth era. Government and expertise do rely on each other, especially in democracy. In democracy, you need professional experts, you need professionalism, which does the best to serve their clients, namely the society itself, basically, but knowing something, knowing the boundaries of what they know, respecting the boundaries of knowledge, and further on. The lesson we hear not only from political philosophers, but from historians such as Timothy Snyder in his magnificent Black Earth, is the lesson that creating and keeping viable constitutional democracy is not possible without creating and keeping citizenship, supporting the rule of law against populistic tendencies. Living in the bubbles and shaping one's identity within them, then I think, or I believe, disintegrates the notion of the citizenship. Therefore, it is extremely hard to come up with a vision of society, of a demos and its future, which could be compelling alternative to very vague demagogic slogans of contemporary populists such as "Make America Great Again" or "Hungary is strengthening," basically which itself is a fake news or a post-truth. The social bubbles left us mute, incapable of using the language of citizenship, community, or solidarity in that respect. And the further consequence of living in bubbles, as far as I can see, is the rise of populism. On the one hand, it sounds surprising since populism is hostile to pluralism. However, it is a different pluralism against which populism aims. Its target is pluralistic liberal democracy with those vital constitutional and social checks and balances that prevent any tyranny of the majority from prevailing over individual human rights, safeguards for minorities, independent courts, a strong civil society, and independent diverse media. Populists say that they speak in the name of the people. The people is here a sovereign which stands over and above all other sources of political authority. By the claim to the voice of the people, populists manage to address the lowest common denominator among as many bubbles, as many social bubbles as possible. Now, finally, what is left to be done? Well, since being from Central European philosopher, the one option would be to go for something like Havel's notion of living in a lie, and bring up again the power of powerless. That would be one option. However, I think that would be kind of a long shot for our meeting. I will focus on more down-to-earth policies, and the two suggestions focus on us, members of academia, members of universities and educational institutions. Last year, The Nature asked several scientists how to deal with the post-truth and experts' loss of credibility. The most common and shared answer was, overcome elitism, go to the community, bring the result of research, and bring what you do out from the university or academy, bring it to the public. Public, like people, can't do the research you do, but it's not the case that they can't hear about it. Now, it is important to see that populism and post-truth environment do actually reinforce this elitism. When ignorance becomes a modern virtue of the crowd, the expert, scientist, of course, naturally tends to pull out from the crowd and find herself a small community of the similarly minded people. This desire towards living in a similarly minded environment leads us directly to my second suggestion. One aspect of this tendency is the so-called confirmation bias, our tendency to look for information that support what we already believe and avoid possible complications. This is why, before scientists publish their work, they try to make sure their findings are robust and pass reality check from qualified colleagues with no personal interest in what they are doing. This is basically the peer review process, which is generally invisible to lay people, however, because the checking and adjustments take place before the product is released. It is keeping the high standards of academic work which necessarily accompany dialogue of experts and laymen within modern democracies. Thank you. Vašek, the turn is yours.
Okay, good evening, everyone. It's a privilege and pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really honored to be in such a great company. It's a mixed blessing, though, to go after these two distinguished speakers. I have an opportunity to already reflect upon some of their remarks, but at the same time, having listened to their talks, I realized that my own talk has been made almost redundant because many arguments which they have mentioned, I share and I have prepared in my talk. So it actually makes it easier for me because I can skip some of the passages and paragraphs, and because we are pressed on time, so we'll leave more time for discussion. So, as it was already mentioned at the beginning, at the introduction, there is hardly any more topical problem today than the one symbolized by these two buzzwords, fake news and post-truth. I have been to quite a few discussions on these two topics, and my impression from some of those, as well as from reading an increasing number of articles and commentaries, is that quite often these two concepts are being sort of blurred, merged together, not distinguished properly. So in my talk, I would like to elaborate on this distinction, or to decouple these two terms a little bit more carefully, and also another reason, apart from the conceptual one, why to treat these two terms separately is, in my opinion, the fact that post-truth, as opposed to fake news, represents a far greater danger to society and democracy than fake news, and I'll try to explain why. So, as it has been mentioned by especially Jakub, but I think Ondřej as well, fake news has been here ever since the dawn of journalism and ever since the dawn of the printing press. And even before, indeed, if we want to go further down in history, actually, you probably have heard or read that Pope Francis has just made a reference to the biblical times only a few days ago as part of his strong criticism of the fake news, which he considers to be an instrument of the devil. And he made a reference to the story about the Garden of Eden as the first ever instance of disinformation. Disinformation used by the snake to persuade Eve to eat the forbidden fruit. So it has a long history, and actually throughout the last half a millennium, the fake news, disinformation, and other instruments of deception and propaganda have been used to start wars, to incite pogroms, to spread hatred. The rise of mass press and so-called yellow journalism in the 19th century is to a significant degree connected with the rise of fake news that were printed with the sole purpose to increase newspaper circulation, such as the New York Sun's article or report, which was labeled "The Great Moon Hoax," published in 1835. The article claimed that there was an alien civilization on the moon, which of course helped to establish the paper as the leading profitable American newspaper. So from this historical perspective, we can certainly claim that there is nothing new under the sun, again, pun intended. Of course, what has changed, and quite dramatically, is the technological environment, and with it the way fake news are being generated and disseminated. With the internet and social media platforms, fake news and disinformation have exponentially increased its velocity, social and political impact. The affordances of social networking sites stimulating the creation of the echo chambers or opinion bubbles, as Jakub has mentioned, amplify and reinforce existing views, rather than support confrontation with dissenting perspectives. And they contribute to faster and deeper polarization of opinions, whilst allowing for factually incorrect, misleading, or entirely fabricated information to gain the kind of prominence and impact that the previous communication technologies would never have provided. Of course, this is a serious problem for democracy, as we have been reminded from numerous commentators ever since at least last year's election of Donald Trump, the President of the United States. But my point here is that describing fake news mainly as online hoaxes and spreading of disinformation by social media platforms, the problem, in doing so, the problem is often framed merely as a technological one. And technological solutions are sought and suggested to fix it, or in a broader sense, that solutions aimed at fixing these technologies, the technology platforms that have been blamed for endangering our democracies. And these solutions, of course, include tougher regulatory approaches by both national and supranational authorities, forcing the platforms to accept more editorial responsibility for the content, to make their algorithms and automated advertising systems more transparent and less easily hijacked for manipulating elections, or to implement various fact-checking programs, flagging up information from dubious sources, and also to crack down on those organizations that are profiting financially from these practices. Germany is currently leading the battle. As you might know, there is a new law effective from the 1st of January that requires social media to take down hate speech, fake news, and illegal content within 24 hours or to face hefty fines. And I have to say I'm generally in favor of these attempts to make the tech giants subject to similar regulatory conditions as those already applicable to traditional media. After all, these companies are competing on the same digital advertising market and swallowing the vast majority of revenues that is generated there. So it is only fair to level the playfield in terms of regulation. But I'm worried that reducing the debate to technological and policy solutions is rather short-sighted, and it's not going to bring the kind of qualitative improvement of our political process and democracy in general that most people are hoping for. In other words, even if Facebook and Twitter manage somehow to eliminate or greatly reduce the amount of hate speech hoaxes and the number of bots and fake profiles, it won't suddenly or miraculously save democracy and help us defeat populism. The reason for my skepticism is that I believe these online hoaxes and fake news are only one, even if significant, symptom of this broader systemic problem that permeates our societies, as captured in the subtitle of this debate. And here I'm already making the transition to the concept of post-truth, which I believe represents a far bigger intellectual challenge than disinformation and fake news, and encapsulates a phenomenon that poses a greater danger to liberal democracy. It has already been defined by Jakub with the use of the Oxford Dictionary, so I won't repeat that. I would rather like to emphasize that also in this definition by Oxford Dictionary, the concept of post-truth highlights the changing mechanisms of social construction and legitimization of knowledge, including the decline of trust in institutions that have been traditionally accepted as its symbolic guardians. Here I would like to quote Rogers Brubaker, an American sociologist, who in a recent article wrote that the institutions that generate, refine, assess, popularize, and disseminate knowledge, that is science, universities, and the mainstream and elite media, have suffered a massive loss in public trust and legitimacy. The digital ecosystem that incubates and circulates what purports to be knowledge is increasingly disconnected from these institutions. A mood of epistemological populism breeds a pervasive suspicion of expertise. To me, this concept of epistemological populism appears particularly useful in capturing this combined effect of political populism that has traditionally been critical of elites and their institutions, and the impact of the new media, particularly social networking sites, on the trustworthiness of information which are generated by these institutions. So under these circumstances, the knowledge derived from experiences and opinions of the common people is placed on a very much same level or above, even above the kind of knowledge produced by expert systems and disseminated by mainstream news media. There are many empirical manifestations of this trend. As somebody working currently in the UK, I have to mention an infamous moment from the 2016 referendum about Brexit, that the whole referendum was driven by an explicitly anti-expert discourse, most memorably epitomized in a public statement by Michael Gove, the then Environment Secretary, who was quoted saying, "People in this country have had enough of experts." There is no doubt that this increasing disdain for expert knowledge has been stimulated by the perceived wisdom of the crowd on the internet and social media. There's a book recently published on this topic called The Death of Expertise, whose author, Tom Nichols, voices fears from the erosion of the status of an expert as someone possessing certain formal qualification to speak about a particular issue. According to him, we are facing a Google-fueled collapse of any division between professionals and lay people, students and teachers, knowers and wanderers. In other words, between those of any achievement in an area and those with none at all. Because I'm pressed by time, I won't go into detail into an example I've prepared about the current attack on scientific expertise. It's about the debate on the safety of vaccines, something you are probably familiar with. I'm kind of interested in because I'm involved in a project looking at the media representation of this debate on vaccinations. But I think, without going into details about it, I think that you're familiar with this issue, which kind of illustrates not only this phenomenon or concept of epistemological populism, but also the fact that the post-truth battlefield is broader than just the area of social media and the internet. It crucially involves other media types, television as well. It is ruled by media logic, not just by the logic of the social media and internet, but media logic in general. It involves the cult of celebrities, and these are all issues and problems which have pre-existed the rise of internet and social media, and that also leads me to believe that it will be much harder to get rid of them even if we sort of fix the internet, if we fix the social media. This phenomenon is likely to remain here for quite some time. Because I'm being told to wrap it up, I'm not going to say too much about the last part, which is what can be done about it. Partially also because some of the arguments which I have prepared very much coincide with what has been said already by Jakub and Ondřej. I would just like to borrow a quote from a journalist, a Guardian journalist, Matthew D'Ancona, who has recently published a very small, very readable book on post-truth, which I recommend you to read. And he says about post-truth, if I may quote, "Post-truth is first and foremost an emotional phenomenon. It concerns our attitude to truth rather than truth itself." So I believe that this recognition of the appeal of emotions should or must even inform our own efforts as citizens and academics, our efforts and activities in defense of facts, in defense of truth, wherever it can be recognized and defined, and in defense of our own expert status, which I think we should not be ashamed of at all. So the task and challenge for us academics is to embrace our social responsibility at this very crucial point and to step up our public engagement in defense of facts, in defense of science-based knowledge, as well as in support of open and civic discourse, both online and offline. Perhaps we can go more in depth into how to do it in the debate. So that's all for me for now. Thank you.
I'm very happy to be here tonight, and I'm especially moved in many ways, but I'm happy and I'm also surprised to be here tonight on this subject, because the previous times we were together in Prague with philosopher friends and friends philosophers. It was on, let's say, peaceful subjects, normal subjects, so to speak. We were here to discuss Bergson, to discuss Canguilhem lately, to discuss various subjects in our European summer universities, and now here we are discussing common dangers that have come very quickly upon us in all our countries. So I'm very happy and surprised to be here on these subjects today. But what I want to try to say after the great analysis that we heard very briefly is that what we are trying to do tonight, and also with Paris, with what we tried to set up in Paris, I think could be thought of as one answer to this danger. If I wanted to insist on one point tonight, is that the answer to fake news is what we try to call in Paris the critical news. In Paris we call it actualité critique, which has been translated. We looked for a translation. Our students and colleagues in Paris were part of the reflection, and the translation we found was critical news. So I want to very briefly first thank you for inviting us and putting us into relationship. Thank you to the French Institute, the French Embassy, the CEFRES, and all the University Charles friends and colleagues. But what I want to try and show is that the answer to fake news is critique, is what we understand by criticism. Because to me, fake news, in all its aspects, is a pathology of criticism. It builds upon criticism as a normal and vital activity, but then it perverts, so to speak, the vital activity of criticism. And this is why what we tend to think of as critical news, actualité critique, is the answer. And I want to insist, and even the extension to what we are building today for the first time, European critical news, is also a vital dimension. So I want to insist on 3 points, very briefly. First, the 2 senses we give to critical news, and then to the European dimension. The first dimension that we gave to the phrase critical news, actualité critique, is what I would call, and that brings me back to Bergson and Canguilhem, our common friends, so to speak, that we share with so many friends in the room. It's what I would call the vital sense of critique, the vital sense of of what is critical. What is critical is what is critical for our lives. And it's like we speak of a critical state in an illness or in a pathology. And I tend to think that what's so dangerous about fake news is that they don't contest any facts. They put contestation towards facts that they think are very vital to an individual or to a community, that are vitally dangerous. And they want to show that someone lies upon something that is vital, something that is vital and mortal and immensely dangerous. So, of course, the fake news are building on the critical aspects of the present, and Ondřej was very right to say that it builds upon a fear, a crisis that has some objective reasons, a world crisis, economical crisis, political crisis, climate, ecological crisis, information crisis, identity, self-situation in the world crisis, and it builds upon the fear. And we know that the emotional thing, among the emotional part of post-truth, there is fear is maybe the first impact. So they always suspect someone not only to lie, but to lie in order to be not to be useful, but to kill you or to be a danger to you. And so to me, the first answer, is to address this sense of the critical, and to address the real dangers of the time. But to address it, of course, with a real diagnosis of what is dangerous today, and real answers and therapeutics to what is dangerous today. This is why I tend to think that medicine, for example, or science as applied to our lives, could still be the best answer to fake news. If you have a broken leg, for example, you don't want any doctor. You want a good doctor that will cure your leg. But then again, so I tend to think with Bergson and Canguilhem that not only there are facts, but that life proves facts. Life is a realistic principle. It's not only a relativistic principle. I mean, we could enter the question of Nietzsche, relativism founded on life, and the medical life facts that prove against death, their truth. But so I tend to think that we have to address dangers to answer fake news, to address, and I will go back to that in 1 second. But then again, and you mentioned that, the fake news go as far as to suspect science, to suspect even vital science, like for example in climate, what we call in French climato-scepticism, skepticism about climate science, or skepticism about vaccine. And so, of course, this is the worst, because even in the Nazi period, of course, when you suspect a doctor to lie, it's the worst accusation. And so we have to, of course, prove the validity of our science, and this is what brings me to the second point. But the first point is very important. We have to address the crisis in our lives, and we can do it. The second point is that, of course, there is a second sense to the critical in critical news. And this is also bringing what the word news means. And in French as well as in English or any language. In French, when you say actualité, it brings back the idea of a fact. Actualité is factualité in a way. But also, of course, of what we hear on radio or on TV, les actualités, that is the news as a speech. News not only as an event, but as someone talking about the event, a discourse. And so I think what is common to fake news and critical news is that they both build on the fact that we have not only facts, but discourse over facts. And so this is the articulation where skepticism enters and can legitimately enter, because we need to criticize the discourse. But we need to criticize the discourse without suspecting every discourse. And so so we need to criticize, and critical news is also a project that tends to think that we need to criticize news even to understand the fake news accusations and to answer the fake news phantasm or creation, because if we answer only by the truth, then we, of course, will be always suspected of hiding the fabrication of truth. And truth is also part of a discourse. So we need critique as well as truth. We don't only need truth, but we need a dose of criticism to answer the pathology of criticism that fake news is bringing to us. And I want to, very briefly, in 1 minute, to oppose what I would call the pathological use of critique and the normal use of critique. Normal in the Canguilhemian sense of healthy, so to speak, or true in a way. And it is very simple. I think, of course, that I will make 3 very brief points. First, of course, the normal use of critique is under the idea of truth. We are looking for truth. And the pathological use of criticism gives away the norm of critique, which is truth itself. So post-truth is a critique with no ground whatsoever. So it's always, what is it criticizing then? It isn't criticizing the facts, it is criticizing the intentions behind the discourse on the facts. Not what we speak about, but who speaks about what we speak about. And this is a very big difference. And where is it most important? Of course, it is in the part of sciences that need critique. And it's not only sciences of nature, because I think climate and vaccine, they will go over critique, because in the end, they prove their efficiency. But of course, it is in the human sciences and social science. This is our field. And for example, in history. But I want to be clear that in France also, and in all over Europe, we won a battle over fake news suspicion. This was the battle over the negation of the existence of the death camps in the Nazi war. Of course, there was the negationists, as we call them in France. And history, in that sense, won this battle. This battle is not fought anymore. It's over. I mean, you can still find people that tell you that there was no extermination program in the Nazi system, but it was won not only through truth, but to a critical establishment of truth. Pierre Vidal-Naquet in France showed that critique was the tool of history. But truth has to be established critically, but not over-critically, not pathologically, under the idea of truth. The second point, which is very important to me, is that good critique, true critique, useful critique, is a critique of under the idea of democracy, under the principles of democracy, but not under the presupposition that we live in democracy, as if it was realized. There is a big difference to be made here. We have to accept the fact that there is an idea of democracy that is of respecting the other, of having good institutions founded on liberty, equality, fraternity, and social justice. And that's what allows the critique. But then we need to criticize our democracies, which are not perfect as democracies, and we need to address the problems of our democracies. And so uncritical democracy is terrible, is a gift to fake truth theories. So we need to respect the frame, but criticize the content of democracy. And it is true also for the institutions of truth and the institutions of critique, like the media and the news. As you know, the word news in English also means the press, the institutions. So you don't criticize the media in general. This is fake news, fascist ideology, but you have to criticize some media, some discourse, some lies, and then if they lie, you go to the tribunals and you respect the tribunals. So you respect the frame of democracy and you criticize the users of democracy. So criticism under the idea of democracy. And of course, it implies the last point that distinguishes for me healthy and pathological criticism. It is the fact that healthy criticism implies always a part of self-criticism, and a dose of what we would call irony. And the figure of Václav Havel here is very interesting because he was defending truth and, of course, irony and humor. And of course, the fake truth advocate not only creates fake truths, not only suspects fake truths, but he suspects everybody except himself. The conspirationist says everyone's lie except me. the Democrat says, even me, I'm not sure of myself, you know. I'm not even sure of what I'm telling you. And self-criticism is, of course, the ultimate criterion. And what I want to end with is, so we need critique to answer the pathology of critique. And we need European criticism. Why do we need European criticism? I will shorten what I wanted to say here, maybe it will come back in the discussion, but what I want to stress is that in keeping with what I just said is that what is Europe? Europe is no ideal world. That it's not what the fake news people want us to believe, that a mythology of peace and love, liberalism. Europe is a space of tensions and difference under the ideas of democracy and truth. But it's a space of tensions and differences. And so what we want to do in a European seminar is not to build a sort of ideal idea of Europe. It's to confront our problems here and there. And you don't have the same fake news actions, and I think that we have in France. And in a way, the fake news debate all over the world is a revealer of local symptoms as well as common problems. And you have this confrontation with your past and with your neighbors and with your politics and your elections, and we have ours. And what we want to do is this seminar is not only identify common problems, but also variations of this problem. And Europe is interesting because in Hungary, they are still denying the First World War solutions. There's in Czech Republic, it's the problem with what you mentioned about Russia, for example, Ondřej. And in France, we still have some, of course, our own civil wars that are coming up from the depths of histories. So we need to confront European histories that fake news issues are tending to deny, but also force us to address. And so Europe is a mirror of the world. For me, it's a microcosm because we have a frame. The world doesn't have a frame, common frame. We have a common frame, and we have common dangers, and we have also different dangers. So this is why I think that European critical use is the answer to the very serious and dangerous fake news problem that you all diagnosed.
I wanted to open the floor to questions that you might have and start the dialogue here. If anybody has some quick...
So good evening and thank you for this interesting debate. I think it seems to me that the problem is really a psychological problem. There is a deep anxiety in Europe and in most of the Western world. And when we talk about expertise, there is the fact that fact-checking by common people is also what they live in their daily life. We have new facts also, like new technologies, artificial intelligence. We have an increase of inequalities, which is not going to stop. We have an environmental crisis, which is really, really worrying. If you look at the facts, you have I don't know how many, it's really, really worrying. And these things for this anxiety is building in populations. So I think they mistrust expertise also for some obvious good reasons. And then how is it possible to address this fact? It is also by rethinking the critical thinking of the experts. And if media is the nervous system of our society, maybe our society is ill somehow. And I don't think it is the social media. I think when there is really a pathology in society, it will express itself in a way or in another. Maybe it's not a very intelligent way, but it's, to say the metaphor of the ill body, something is not working very well. And then to talk about the media as a nervous system, is it really reflecting realities? I mean, the reality the common people live. Is it really reflecting these realities? I don't think so. There is also a problem of democracy in the media. we have to say that mainstream media is also under the influence of big companies, for instance. It is also a way to sell lots of goods. And with all these very, very, how do you say, important systemic thresholds we are going to face in the coming years, like inequality, like ecosystemic biomes, there is a collapse of ecosystems. If the media is not able to be really democratic, to have like real experts and real debates, if it does not reflect realities of societies, we are going to face really, really huge problems, and it will not just be a problem of vaccines, or it will. I think it will really, it will grow. It's a problem that will grow because there is a big anxiety in society. Thank you.
Maybe one word, just because it seems to me to be very close to what I said, in a sense that we need to criticize, but to criticize with facts and to criticize with a frame. We could criticize to enforce the democratic frame, not to threaten the democratic frame. So if the frame and the goal of criticism is clear, then we need to do what you did. Science is critical of itself. Media are in a critical institution system. We can address corruption. We can address equality. We have in some countries mechanisms to avoid the control of media by companies. It will never be perfect, but it's the way we saved the French health system, for example. There was a scandal with the health system. What saved the French health system is not a diabolization of the system. It was a strict conflict of interest law. So this is also how we fight against what you said, it's through democratic institutions.
There was another question there.
May I just a short, sorry, apologies. Just two short reactions on it. And the first concerns the term general population. It is always extremely complicated to talk about general population. General population, on one hand, is capable of using instruments which are far technologically advanced and more complicated than the first aircrafts which carried human beings into the cosmos. On the other hand, a serious large group of them is unable to even check the prices of electricity bill and gas bill. So this is what we all have under the heading of a general population. It's extremely complicated to balance those two. On the very last point upon which you react, there is something which is called the freedom of the speech. However, some authors recently are coming back. It's Sam Leibowitz in her book Free Speech and Free News and Unfree News, coming back to the idea of the freedom of the news. It is a term coined by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, basically how to address the right of the reader to meaningful news rather than of the media to speak, namely exactly how to avoid the possible conflict of business and media on one hand, or media and politics on the other, as, for example, right now we see here in Czech Republic.
Thank you so much. You gave so much better words to my sensitiveness on the topic. I hope this doesn't sound provocative, but still, though I really appreciated the four presentation, I would just like to start from a couple of questions that Ondřej opened up to try to see this phenomenon of the fake news as a sort of vaccine. Now we are under the sign of Canguilhem and somehow dealing with these images of the body. You ask, Ondřej, did we really go wrong, and why people trust dubious sources? So you ask what went wrong, and I would ask, did we really go wrong? Because in some regards, we can see this crisis that Frédéric was also talking about as a sort of manifestation of a previous faith in the system of the media. I remember, I'm not so old, and when I started to teach philosophy, one of my main concerns was that of developing a critical marge in the students that basically would mean to tell them that what they would see in television is not completely true. Possibly, we have always been, as you were mentioning, trusting dubious sources. What comes out now is, as there is this precisely this infrastructure you were mentioning, and the fact that possibly there is a parallel or several parallel infrastructures that are somehow cooperating in order to give a third dimension to the word of the fake news. Often these fake sources quote each other in order to build, to mime, as the Pope somehow was mentioning in his message, there is a sort of mimesis. So we are witnessing a sort of mimetic monsters that coming out is showing us what Paul Valéry used to call, since the beginning of last century, the fiducia, the trust that underlies the structure itself of our society. As well as we are becoming more aware of this emotional impact of the news. And so I would say this vaccine of the phenomenon of the post-truth is somehow revealing a crisis of the paradigm of truth that we embrace in our culture. And in this way, this opens also up the possibility of a sort of renewal or reform of revolution of our idea of what is truth, and this on a broader base. Just one last thing, you've been mentioning pretty much the role played by academia, but I had the feeling you were rather insisting on academia in its mission of expert training. Academia has a very important pedagogic mission. And I do believe that this is a very important aspect. Probably we are going to be more and more paradoxically left alone to our judgment, and to do so, the only resource will be the critical tools that each of us has as a citizen. So I do believe that in this aspect, the fact that the experts are often also teachers is something very important.
I completely agree, and in my last part of my paper I have put an emphasis on the pedagogical proposals that we might develop in order to counter the dissemination of fake news. And I have, my point was that we cannot really teach truth, so since we will again be accused of just defending one-sided portion of truth, but we can surely teach attitudes, such as critical thinking about what's wrong in this part of argument, why argument ad hominem is not worthy. And it's also the last time that people are gathered from different classes, if we don't have much elitist system of schools. It might be the last time that they really gathered from different milieus before going back to the social bubbles where the information that is getting to them is already filtered. And my point here was that it's not only the question of being right or wrong, but it's also the question of principles around which the consensus in our society should be built. So what is the right thing to do when it comes to the respect of others in terms of justice, healthcare, and equality?
I just quote, "An education to media and to criticism is an obvious necessity. But what about an education to technological knowledge of digital platforms and digital economy in order to understand the manufacturing on news online?" I think it's mostly directed to you. And I want to add, maybe, and I wanted to add another concern that I had. It was interesting that you talked a lot about the profit-driven media, but it's another phenomenon that is appearing is that a lot of the traditional media have been bought by investors that don't have a direct interest in profit as much as because it's so marginal in their economic activity, the media, so that it becomes just a tool to give a shape to public opinion, and profit and the public is not even an interest anymore, and so that brings it a further change too. So it's interesting that if profit is a problem, now we have another problem as well.
I will give a very short answer, and I will leave the answer about the financial aspect to you, if you. So, one problem with the sharing of fake news is that once they are shared, they make the tour around the globe, and nobody reads then the contradictory evidence. So what we can do in the teaching of digital literacy in classes is really to develop reflexes about checking twice before sharing anything, and even developing attitudes as it's ludicrous, it's bad for your reputation online if you share from really dubious sources something that might be proven wrong. So, and it only when it becomes a reflex, then it is helpful. Because if not, check-faking sites are low profile, little red, so we might help them. And I will leave the other part of it.
This is a very big problem of the current media landscape in this country and in other countries of Central and Eastern Europe especially, but also in Western Europe and in France, in fact. Italy, obviously, in southern European countries like Greece or Spain. So, of course, we know that the media news-making business is in crisis. And it is in crisis, has been in crisis for years, mostly because of the internet, because of the inability of media corporations to adapt on the internet age and to make profit out of internet. But increasingly, because of the dominance of the platforms of Facebook and Google in particular, who have established a duopoly on the digital advertising market and basically are siphoning out the majority of the revenues generated there, leaving nothing to the actual content producers, to the traditional news media corporations. But that might be beside the point you're making. Back to the question of the profit of or lack of it, and the impact on the content. Well, in some cases, in some specific instances, you are right that the media owners are these big oligarchs or industrialists who don't mind subsidizing their media by a profit made in other parts of their business, in other sectors. But I would argue that even these billionaires are trying to motivate their media to behave in a way that they don't need to subsidize them so much. After all, they are businessmen. They do look at the registers and the lists, and they don't want to be losing money unnecessarily. So even these media that are in the hands of big businessmen and oligarchs, they are acting as commercial corporations. And I would say that the impact is not as big in terms of the way they behave on the market. And I would even add, not sure that this is actually what you asked about, but we know especially from the experiences in this country and other Central and Eastern European countries, that in order for the media to maintain their autonomy, they need to be making profit. It's not a bad thing for professional journalism, it's a necessity. And it is entirely possible that the lack of trust in some of these news media, which we have been seeing in various polls and the research, the lack of trust on the side of the public is also due to the fact that people know about these ownership relations. They are well aware of the fact that some of the media basically are acting in the interests of their owners as opposed to in public interest. So there is a strong connection between the trajectory of losing trust and the ownership situation.
Thank you.
And I would like to ask something that I've seen coming through all of your presentation. You all seem to emphasize that fake news and post-truth is not a new phenomenon, and I'm pretty much with you about that. However, there was, at each presentation, I had the feeling, a sort of fantasy of the world as we knew it that was still slipping through. For instance, Ondřej, you emphasized that people don't care anymore about experts. And my question would be, when did they exactly care about what people up there and the elites are talking about? And Jakub, also in his very nice account and historical account, you've been asking about citizenship, and I very much like this disengraded citizenship. However, I was wondering, when did we exactly have an attachment to citizenship? If we look at precisely our Central European history, the national identities, the cultural identities, we see that they are very young. And if we look on social identities, we see that it's a very contested history. And actually, this is this contestation that I have in mind. And one of the answers could be in Václav Štětka's proposition about the epistemological populism. Or I would even call it epistemological contestation, because it seems to me, and that's what Frédéric said, it's not about fact, it's about contesting the fact. It's about a political stance. That was actually one of the highly quoted comments in Nature debate, that it has become a political stance. So it does not, you don't care what these people, if this what the people are saying, if it is true or not, you just want to contest them. It's over. And there was one word with respect of all that I was missing in this talk, and that was culture. Because it seems to me that it's a culture war. It's not about truth. It's not about philosophy. It's a new, so my question would be, what is this momentum? Is it that we are aware suddenly of all these rages and all these bubbles that are not having our opinions? Because these battles about Holocaust, for instance, they're coming back. And they're coming back even, I mean, I want to remind you that the Austrian government has a far-right people in the government itself that are actually questioning Holocaust. So these are back. So my question would be, how do we get the culture in that debate? Do we have analytical tools to do that? Do we have a political tools to do that?
To me, there are two new phenomena, not only one, and that make it a wider problem. First, it's the media, which allow any doubting citizen to put his doubt or skepticism or suspicion on the public sphere somewhere, even if it's not read, so it's internet. Then the second thing, to me, which is not studied enough, is that the contestation of the experts now, or of the elites, comes from within, comes from the elites themselves. That's new. You have now experts on TV sets, and in France too, that contest expertise, that contest truth. You have politicians, even presidents in some countries, that contest science. This is not so ancient. This is really new. You always had the virtue, even if the hypocrisy from the elites to not go into this criticism. And I think that's what Hannah Arendt, of course, together with psychologists, studied, that when the authorities legitimize the suspicion, then it's a qualitative change. It's not the same problem. I mean, when you have the president of the United States that cuts the science credits, that now even interrupted the science commission in the White House, whereas Obama met the science counselor every week, whatever happened in the world. He had 1 hour a week with his science counselor. So this is symbolic, and that's culture. That's culture broadly, because you have a cultural war, as you said, but it is led not only from the basis against the elites, it is led within the elites. And now we have intellectuals, anti-intellectualism within the intellectual. And of course, this is as old as cultural wars, but it has a new legitimacy, and this is very new to me that you have this criticism. Even in the vaccine crisis in France, you have major doctors that now feed the skepticism against vaccination. Not only, individuals, but people in the academy, the medicine academy.
I think that it might be helpful to address the issue of why are the fake news so widely spread and why there's mistrust towards expert knowledge also in terms of cultural struggle instead of, for example, class struggle, which is not helping here. And we could have seen this in the Tuesday's presidential debate on Prima. I don't know if you would classify Prima television mainstream media, but it was followed by 2 million Czech citizens among 10 million, so it has a large impact.
You have to recall how Paris
that
you have an election.
We have an election at the second tour of presidential election this Saturday, and the subject chosen by this television were precisely the subjects of cultural wars. It was immigration, it was smoking, they even tried to introduce gun holding or gun holders, because gun holding is one of the dividing issue in an American context. So they tried to incorporate it here already, and it's completely ludicrous because there is no tradition of gun holding in Czech Republic. But some people want to take profit from this issue in order to make our country even more divided. And so here it's really the responsibility of the mainstream media, if Prima is mainstream or is widely followed, to reinforce the dichotomy and to really want to divide the people in two groups who just are shouting one against each other. And it was a really bad example of how not to do and how not to choose the subjects for a presidential debate.
I'm very glad that the term culture was brought in the debate. I think it was indeed missing, but I feel like in order to actually elaborate on it in detail, we would have to really dissect it and go case by case or distinguish these different aspects of the debate where culture and cultural war might be applicable as a sort of explanatory framework for the phenomenon of post-truth or fake news, and where perhaps not so much. What I have in mind is that in America, obviously, there is a big overlap between this segment of alternative news or fake news and the alt-right phenomenon. But when it comes to the debates on climate change or vaccination, I'm not sure if we're talking about cultural wars there, because it's kind of cross-sectional much more. So I feel like, yeah, indeed, this is something we should debate more in detail, but distinguish at the same time.
I wanted to ask if you, because Ondřej, you talked about, the pedagogy in school, and if you think, or if you see academia as you experienced it, that it actually leads to this consensus-seeking attitude. And I ask that because I'm mostly formed by like feminist and post-colonial discourse, and I encounter at the university, it's ignorance at best, oftentimes hostile attitudes, even when in like things that are like fact stuff, not just method approach stuff. So my experience of academia. And also because, you just publish in journals that are going to publish your stuff, so that's what they're going to read. So I'm never going to read about, classical Plato studies, because why should I? So I see academia as just, a subsection that copies the whole societal structure. And I don't know, maybe you experience it differently, so I just asked because you proposed.
Yes, the consensus comes at its price. And I am aware that there is an order of discourse within the academia that is marginalizing some currents, even within philosophical field, which is supposedly the most open. And that it might be discriminating, and sometimes it's just bad reputation of a discipline, some rumors, gossip, circulating that what is done in post-colonial studies is not as serious as what is done in phenomenology. And of course, this is really wrong, to have such a prejudicial attitude. So that's why the self-criticism is needed, and I say we should start with ourselves. One proposal how to start with the self-criticism is to ask about this abundance of publishing within the academia, if it's not part of the same symptom.
The way that academia is formed, at least like here right now, not just with how it's financed, which is also a problem in publishing for the public, but how students go to seminars and you do research, but so an institution, I don't know, like a seminar or something where people with different attitudes would kind of interact, hopefully open-mindedly. I'm not saying I'm open-minded though, so if there isn't, if any of you perceive academia as it is right now formed in like concrete institutions, what you're used to doing, how you think about what you're doing, how you encounter other people, how classrooms are formed and stuff like that, if you perceive it as helpful to create this kind of consensus-seeking attitude that should lead to the ideal of democracy, if at all. Yeah. So if you think
it's true that what we observe, there are like two different tendencies within universities or within academia, which we might observe in a couple of last years. One of them is that the universities do try to open themselves up to the public and to the society around it. It's complicated in a lot of ways. The relation between the university and the society, and I talk about, let's say, public universities, or especially, but universities. And the relation is quite complicated. The societies are used to different modes of functioning than universities, but they do. On the other hand, and you are absolutely right, the other aspect is, let's say, an extreme professionalization, which can be observed in the growth of number of departments at a given institution. Compare the number of departments at a certain institution, I don't know, in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, you will see how it grows up. And there used to be, a couple of decades ago, in the 90s, this word interdisciplinary. And everybody hoped that the interdisciplinary approach would solve all the problems or the maladies which you said, and somehow, if I'm not mistaken, it vanished. Somehow it lost its claims, and it's obvious that that there is needed something else. There is needed. I'm not saying not to combine it, but to combine it from a different methodology, different level than the former multidisciplinary approach suggested. That we have to gather up all our mental capacities to be capable of talking with people of other backgrounds, and both in academia and outside.
So she or he asks, could fake news be the result of a managerial society ruled according to indicators and figure rather than be by individuals that would be actor of a collective project?
The answer would be kind of unsurprising. Partially, yes. And I will try to, yes, I kind of dwelled on the importance of quantity. And yes, you there in Paris are right in translating it into the managerial terms, and it's usually yet again connected with the university problem, because one of the problems which we face in the last couple of years or even decades is exactly the problem of the managerial system controlling the universities, talking about the outcomes and so forth, so on. But I mean, yes, one option might be that a fake news sells better than a proper news, let's say, or a certain level, or it's cheaper at a certain level, right? But I don't think that it is the whole truth, and it can't be the whole truth. I think that Vácek was right, Václav Štětka was right, to insist on the emotions in the play, in the emotions in the role. And I think that this is another aspect which can't be conquered only by managers must be good psychologists as well if they want to succeed. But there is something else than what comes into the mind, not only the profit, let's say, it's a huge part of it, but the emotions as well.
I'm not sure I would completely agree with conflating this concept of managerial society with the current prevalence of fake news and post-truth phenomenon. It is just out of the top of my head, really. I haven't thought it through, but it seems to me that managerial society is a concept emphasizing expertise rather than denying it. It's a specific kind of expertise, but managers, after all, should be qualified to do their job, trained in order to perform their functions and possess certain certified knowledge. That they can demonstrate. That kind of knowledge and certification can be fake itself, but there is this discourse that at least it should be pretended, that they should pretend to have it, to possess it. So if we go back to the definition of the post-truth phenomenon, which really the core is in the denial of expertise or erosion of expertise, and the emphasis on common people's knowledge and experience, rather than facts which are derived and generated by certain established elite institutions, then I think that there is a certain division between these concepts.
Actually, there's just a missing dot. I just missed one thing that you people really have good debate that you did, but I was expecting the media to be considered as one of the multi-level governance, in the sense that I see the media beside the states as a regulator in the society. We are underestimating the power of the media. And I actually think that when I take this in consideration to my country, in Austria, I actually could see that the past election in my country was mostly played in the media. And the media is some sort of political and policy arena where the actors meet there to really regulate the society. So I think that in social science or in research, it's so that we are actually not looking at this power the way the media regulate the society. So I was saying maybe I bring that in, and probably maybe you have some other aspect to feed us to also maybe justify if we actually not gonna see fake news as a commodity of the media. Because for me, the media is another way like a market where buyers and sellers meet and politicians meet there in the discourse to get information to pass on policy in the society. So fake news is for me like a product. And as Homo economicus, the media is also a business man, if we could identify it as a person. Thank you.
Well, I can only agree. I think that it has been mentioned actually by Jakub that if the truth was a commodity, it would be all over internet and all over Facebook. But the opposite is the true. Not entirely, but yes, fakes or lies and manipulation sells better than the truth in general. So yes, fake news is a commodity, and there are whole kind of mini industries specializing on the production and commodification of fake news. We've seen it already in the context of the US elections in 2016. We've been seeing it ever since. And I think you made a very good point and observation that this commodity, which has previously been or originally been sort of restricted to the fringes of the internet, is now making its way into the mainstream. So the mainstream media, at least some of them, are trying to incorporate various types of fake news, maybe not entire lies, but various misinformation into their reporting. We have in the Czech Republic here several examples of such mainstream media that are not afraid of disseminating lies or manipulations and fake news, as we name it. So definitely that this is a process which is expanding, and I fear that it is now the alternative, so-called alternative news media scene that is increasingly setting the agenda for mainstream news media.
I want to add one point. I'm always embarrassed when we speak of something in general. like politicians, etc., and media. Of course, there is the media power, and which is also in the tradition of Republican theory thought of as a counterpower, in a balance of powers between the political, the legislator, the judiciary, and the media, and the education, and so forth. And there is a power of the media in general, but what I think we ought to fight for is not against the media power. It's within the media system to preserve diversity, to preserve critical variety and audience to the critical media. Of course, this is the good fight. I mean, don't be mistaken. I mean, to be against media to me is to be against democracy. But to be against the domination, the monopolies, whether mainstream at some point or now fake news media, and I mean that's the good fight to have. I mean, and again, this is a fight for democracy. When the media system is dominated by one power, who will act against it? It's the political system. When the political system begins to become a dictature or a democrature, as we call it, I don't know if you have this concept also here, a mixture between democracy and dictature, then we have to fight for the media against the dictature. In Turkey, I want to be with the media, okay? It's very clear to me. To be against the media in our world is not the good position to have. And of course, who is against the media now? It's some heads of state. I mean, so we don't have to be against or for media in general, but to have a critical theory and practice and support and action for the good diversity of media's plural in our society is plural. And of course, maybe it can be difficult because there are economic forces behind the media system. There is this corruption system. There is this mixing of spheres of power, the political and the media, the economical and the media. But what we have to fight for, again, I mean, I want to be with the politicians that want to protect us from these things, and not to be with the politicians that are against media or even for media in general. This is just, to me, another danger. I mean, so let's be critical. That is also make differences.